Okay, so you are curious on how you can acquire your first rental property. Well, this is going to be the video for you, so stay tuned. In this video, we are going to be going over the 5 steps or processes I would say that you want to look out for and be prepared for when it comes to purchasing your first rental property. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Nielsen. I am a local real estate agent here in the state of Utah. A little over a year ago, we purchased our first rental property, a duplex in Springville, and we used the trick house hacking to be able to get into the rental property, get into our first home, and start real estate investing all at the same time. So if this is interesting for you, then make sure you stay tuned for the full video. If this is the first time you're here on my channel, welcome. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you are interested in home buying, selling, investing, and relocating tips here to Utah, home tours, new construction, and anything else that's related to the real estate industry, hit that subscribe button so that way you make sure you can stay tuned for all the future content. If you're coming back to my channel, thank you so much for supporting. Now stay tuned for this video. So that's gonna bring us to part number 1, which is, are you gonna be living in it, or are you just acquiring it to rent out to other people exclusively? Now there's gonna be a major factor in how much money you're gonna have to put down to be able to acquire that rental property. If you are gonna be living in it yourself as a primary residence for at least 1 year, then you can take advantage of the primary residence down payment loan programs. Typically, that's only gonna be 3.5%, 3 or maybe even 5% down to be able to acquire a rental property. Now that is amazing because most of the time rental properties are going to be anywhere from 10 to 25%. Another option that you got to consider is that if you're going to be renting it out to other people completely, but maybe having it as like a vacation home, then you could take advantage of like a 10% or like a secondary home option. And lastly, if you're going to be having more of like a long-term rental where you're going to have long-term tenants, then typically you're going to need about 20 to 25% down to be able to purchase that rental property. So it really comes down to how much money you have saved and what are your goals. Are you trying to live in it yourself to get started with home buying process yourself and real estate investing? Or are you just trying to get a rental property to fill in for someone else? Depending on your financial situation is depending on what option is going to be available for you. Part 2 is going to be whether you want long-term or short-term tenants. So after you figured out whether you're going to be living in it or you're going to be renting out to other people, you got to figure out if it's going to be more of like a long-term or a short-term rental. Right now, there are a lot of people that are going after the short-term rentals. They're taking advantage of like the higher daily rates and being able to cash flow a little bit more on the property. But some things that you need to be in mind are, what are the city regulations in terms of your property being used as an Airbnb or VRBO or a short-term rental? Before you buy a property, based on your goals, you want to figure out what are the regulations, rules, any restrictions that pertain to you buying a property for short-term or long-term rentals. For the most part, most places will allow you to do a long-term rental. On the other hand, there are some cities and areas that are cutting back and limiting how many short-term rentals can be in the area or if they can be in the area at all. So if your city doesn't allow it, then short-term rental is just going to be out of the game. Now, one of the great things about short-term rentals is that you could potentially get more cash or more cash flow coming in from renting it out versus a long-term rental. My wife and I, we currently have a rental here in Springville, Utah, and we're doing a long-term rental, and we are getting just a little bit over $1,000 a month. On the other hand, I have a buddy that's up in the Salt Lake area that has a duplex where he's living in one portion and he's Airbnb-ing out the second portion of the home. That alone is paying for his mortgage. So the difference is, does your city allow it? Do you want to take on those responsibilities of being a short-term rental landlord? Or do you want to be more of the long term? For us, we were completely happy and fine with having a long-term rental because it was a little bit more secure for us, and we were totally fine with having that versus a short term. While it doesn't pay for all of our mortgage, it greatly subsidizes it, which makes it an awesome trick when getting into real estate investing. Now, part 3 is going to be kind of what we talked in part 2 is location and where. You're going to want to figure out where you want to invest in your real estate property. Do you want to have something that's going to be more in vacation vacation spot, a touristy spot? Do you want something that's going to be more for your house itself? All of these factors are going to play in whether it's going to be a long-term or short-term rental. Are you in an area that has a lot of colleges where you could take advantage of the rental demand for those college students? The other thing to keep in mind is your city a little bit more landlord friendly, or are they a little bit more tenant friendly? And then also figuring out how much could you potentially get for rents in that area. Different areas are going to have different demand, which is going to vary on how much you can get for that rental property. And that brings us into part number 4, which are what are the rents and who's paying the expenses. So some things to keep in mind are, what are the average home prices going for in the area, and what are some of the average rents going for in the area? You'll want to have a good idea of what your potential income could be and versus what your potential expenses could be. You don't want to go into an area and invest a bunch of money to all of a sudden find out that you're maybe not going to get as much rent as you would like, and it's going to be a little bit more expensive for you to take on. For an example, when my wife and I ended up purchasing our place, our duplex, we got our place for just a little bit under $400,000. Our mortgage payment ended up being roughly around $1,950, but we knew that rental rates in the area were above $1,000. So that itself was going to end up covering for our mortgage completely. Now we have a top and a bottom unit, and most bottom units in the area were going for at least $1,000 for a 2-bedroom, 1-bath. Typically what you'll want to do is make sure that the tenants will end up paying the utilities themselves. That's going to make sure that they're being a little more conscious of the utility usage, and it's going to limit the expenses and bring it down for themselves. So that's going to bring us into the last part number 5, which are what's your total income and what are your total expenses. What you'll want to start doing is, after you've figured out whether it's a short-term, long-term rental, the location, then you're going to want to figure out, okay, what are the average home prices based on how much I'm putting down, taxes, insurance, and all of that. What is roughly going to be my monthly mortgage payment? From there, start taking a look at the rent. See if it's going to be able to cover everything and more, so that way you are positive when it comes to cash flow. Because if you're going to be purchasing a property and renting out to other people completely, then that's when you want to make sure that not only do you have enough rental income to cover your mortgage, taxes, insurance, and interest, and all of that, you also want to make sure that you're going to have some extra for reserves. You want to be putting a certain amount aside each month for any sort of repairs, maintenance, and just long-term repairs. Put a stockpile in there so that way when these big items do come up, you have that money to be able to go and repair that. On the other hand, if you're going to be living in the house yourself, you can have a little bit more flexibility when it comes to the income versus the expenses. For us, we weren't too worried about what the total mortgage and then the rents were going to be, because we were just purchasing this house for ourselves. Also, we were excited to get into the housing market and also to get started with real estate investing. Our mortgage wasn't that much, and we already had a good idea of what rents were going to be. Now, the great thing about this is that we are currently living in the top unit and renting out the bottom unit, which pays for roughly 2/3 of just our mortgage. Now, when we move out of the property, we will be able to increase the rents for the basement, rent for the top part of the house, and make sure that tenants are paying for all of the utilities themselves. And that's when we'll start cash flowing on the property. This is when it starts to get really fun, because now you have an asset that's being paid for by your tenants. All the mortgage, all the expenses, and everything is being covered by your tenants, and you're getting some cash flow. So when you go on to get your next place, that cash flow can be used to subsidize part of your next mortgage or your next rental property. And that's how it can keep snowballing and keep propelling forward. So that is it, everybody. Those are the 5 steps on how to get started on buying your first rental property. I hope this has helped. If it has, hit that like button. I would really appreciate it because it would help me out a bunch. And if you have any other questions when it comes to this, I know I didn't go over everything. Put your question down in the comments and I'll be happy to answer that and any other questions that you might have. If you're interested in looking in rental properties here in the state of Utah, let me know. Here's my contact information and we could come up with a game plan on how you can get your first rental property. Thank you so much for watching my video, and we'll see you on the next one.